When a struggling farmer discovers mysterious golden seeds in his ancient barn, he's convinced they're just corn seeds covered in dust. But after planting them in his field, what grows from the soil is so extraordinary that scientists from around the world rush to his farm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tucked away in a forgotten corner of his grandfather's old barn lay a small burlap sack with strange, shimmering golden seeds inside. At first, Michael Barrett thought they were just regular corn seeds covered in some kind of old dust or fungus, but when he tried to wipe them clean, the golden color remained. The seeds felt unusually warm to the touch, almost as if they were alive with their own energy, pulsing with an ancient vitality he had never encountered before in his 25 years of farming. The barn, a weathered structure that had stood on his Montana farm for over a century, had been slated for demolition that spring. The harsh winter winds had finally taken their toll on the old building, leaving it leaning precariously to one side, its timbers groaning with each gust that swept down from the Rocky Mountains. The roof had begun to cave in at several points, and the insurance company had made it clear: either tear it down or lose coverage for the entire property. Michael had been putting off the demolition for months, partly due to the expense, but mostly because of the memories the old building held. That particular morning had started like any other on the Barrett family farm. Michael had risen before dawn, his joints aching from the previous day's work, to check on his struggling wheat fields. The drought had been particularly brutal this year, turning much of his crop into withered stalks barely worth harvesting. As he walked the perimeter of his fields, calculating how much longer he could hold out before having to consider selling some of his land, he'd noticed the demolition notice had blown off the barn's door, scuttling across the dusty ground like a tumbling autumn leaf. With a heavy heart, he'd decided to finally begin clearing out the last of the old equipment. The barn had been his grandfather's pride and joy, filled with decades of agricultural innovations and experiments. Old Jack Barrett had been something of a legend in Paradise Valley, known as much for his eccentric farming methods as for his uncanny ability to grow crops in soil others had deemed worthless. As Michael worked his way through the cluttered interior, each item he moved stirred up memories of summer days spent learning at his grandfather's knee. It was late afternoon when he noticed something odd about one of the floorboards near the back wall. Unlike its neighbors, weathered and worn smooth by countless boots, this board seemed slightly raised, as if it had been deliberately loosened. Curiosity got the better of him, and as he pried it up, the mysterious sack tumbled out from its hiding place. Next to it lay a faded note in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting, but most of it was too worn to read, except for two words that made Michael's heart race: miracle seeds. Michael's hands trembled as he examined the seeds more closely. Each one was perfectly formed, about the size of a corn kernel but rounder, with intricate patterns swirling across their golden surfaces. In the dim light filtering through the barn's weathered boards, they seemed to catch and hold the sunlight, creating tiny prisms that danced across the dusty floor. He counted exactly 50 seeds in total, each one identical to the last, their mysterious markings unlike anything he'd ever seen in his years of farming or during his agricultural studies at Montana State University. The seeds themselves defied logic. Their color wasn't the dull yellow of corn or the pale gold of wheat, but rather a deep, rich gold that seemed to shift and change as he turned them in his hands. The patterns on their surface reminded him of ancient Celtic knots he'd once seen in a museum, but these were more complex, more organic, as if they had grown naturally rather than being carved or etched. As he stood there in the musty barn, memories of his grandfather flooded back. Old Jack Barrett had been known throughout the valley for his experimental farming techniques and his endless quest to develop more resilient crops. People used to call him crazy, especially after he returned from his last expedition to South America, babbling about lost agricultural knowledge and seeds that could change the world. There are mysteries in this soil that modern science hasn't even begun to understand, he used to say, his eyes twinkling with conviction. Michael remembered the countless hours he'd spent as a child, listening to his grandfather's stories about legendary crops from ancient civilizations, plants that could survive any drought, heal any illness, and feed entire communities with just a handful of seeds. Tales of the Aztecs' golden corn, the lost grains of the Incas, and mysterious plants that supposedly held the secret to eternal life. At the time, he dismissed these tales as the fanciful dreams of an old man, choosing instead to focus on modern farming techniques and scientific methods. The rational part of Michael's mind tried to dismiss the discovery. After all, he was a practical farmer, educated in modern agricultural science. He knew about genetic modification, hybrid crops, and the latest farming technologies. These seeds, no matter how unusual they looked, had to have a logical explanation. Perhaps they were an experimental variety his grandfather had been working on, or maybe even some sort of elaborate prank left behind to be discovered. But there was something about them that defied rational explanation. The way they seemed to warm his palm, the mysterious patterns on their surface, and that strange, almost luminescent golden color. It all hinted at something beyond his understanding. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the barn's broken boards, Michael made a decision that would change not only his life, but potentially the future of agriculture itself. He carefully wrapped the seeds back in their burlap container, tucking his grandfather's note safely inside. The demolition crew was scheduled to arrive in 3 days to tear down the old barn, but Michael knew he couldn't let these seeds be lost to the rubble. Whatever they were, they represented not just a mystery to be solved, but perhaps his grandfather's legacy. And maybe, just maybe, the answer to his struggling farm's problems. As Michael walked back to his farmhouse, the weight of the seeds in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step. The last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold that eerily matched the color of his discovery, and for a moment, he could have sworn he felt the seeds pulse with warmth against his leg, as if responding to the dying light. The cool Montana evening air carried the scent of approaching rain, and somewhere in the distance thunder rumbled across the valley. Little did Michael know that these mysterious golden seeds would not only transform his farm, but would soon capture the attention of scientists, researchers, and agricultural experts from around the globe. The simple act of pulling up that loose floorboard would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about farming, science, and the ancient secrets lying dormant in his family's land. As he reached his front porch, the first drops of rain began to fall, and somewhere in the depths of his pocket, the golden seeds seemed to pulse with anticipation. Life hadn't been kind to the Barrett family farm over the past decade. Once a thriving operation spanning over 500 acres of Montana's most fertile soil, the farm had been steadily shrinking as Michael was forced to sell off parcels of land just to keep the rest afloat. His grandfather's death 5 years ago had marked the beginning of their decline, and since then, it seemed like every season brought a new challenge. Michael sat at his kitchen table that evening, the mysterious golden seeds spread out before him under the harsh fluorescent light. The old farmhouse creaked and groaned in the growing storm, its sounds as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Through the window, lightning illuminated the distant mountains, and he could see his withering wheat fields bending in the wind. Fields that should have been ready for harvest by now. The latest bank statement lay unopened beside the seeds, but Michael didn't need to look at it to know the numbers. The drought had devastated his wheat crop for the 3rd consecutive year, and the new irrigation system he'd installed last spring, funded by a second mortgage, had proven insufficient against Montana's increasingly arid climate. Modern farming techniques and technology, which had promised so much during his university days, seemed powerless against the changing weather patterns. His mind wandered to the community around him. Paradise Valley had once been home to dozens of family farms, but now only a handful remained. Most had been bought out by large agricultural corporations or converted into luxury ranches for wealthy out-of-staters. The Wilson family down the road had sold their property just last month, ending 5 generations of farming. Their eldest son, Tommy, had been in Michael's class at school. Now he worked as a manager at the local supermarket selling imported produce where local crops had once thrived. The irony wasn't lost on Michael. His grandfather had spent years warning about the dangers of industrial farming and the loss of agricultural diversity. "When we lose our seeds," old Jack used to say, "we lose our freedom." Michael had dismissed these concerns as the paranoid ramblings of an old man clinging to outdated methods. Now, watching his own farm slowly die while massive mono-crop operations flourished, he wondered if his grandfather had been right all along. Rising from the table, Michael walked to the old oak cabinet where his grandfather had kept his most important documents. Behind a false panel, another of old Jack's paranoid habits that suddenly seemed less foolish, he found a leather-bound journal he hadn't opened since the funeral. The pages were filled with his grandfather's cramped handwriting, documenting decades of agricultural experiments and observations. Mentions of expeditions to remote corners of South America, conversations with indigenous farmers, and detailed notes about ancient growing techniques filled the yellowed pages. As he read deeper into the journal, Michael's heart began to race. There, dated just 3 months before his grandfather's death, was an entry about golden seeds. The handwriting was shakier than the earlier entries, but the excitement was evident in every word. "Finally found them. The legends were true. These seeds are the key to everything. Drought-resistant, naturally pest-repellent, and with nutritional properties that could revolutionize modern agriculture. But they're not ready yet. They need time to mature, to adapt to our soil. I've hidden them where only family will find them. When the time is right." The entry ended there, as if his grandfather had been interrupted mid-thought. Michael turned the page, hoping for more information, but found only blank pages. The timing coincided with old Jack's final stroke, the one that had left him unable to speak or write during his last few weeks of life. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and Michael jumped as thunder rattled the windows. The storm was directly overhead now, and the rain hammered against the roof with increasing intensity. He returned to the kitchen, where the golden seeds still lay on the table, their mysterious patterns seeming to shift and dance in the flickering light. The stakes were becoming clear. His farm was failing, and conventional methods weren't working anymore. The bank was unlikely to extend any more credit, and another failed season would mean the end of the Barrett family farm. These seeds, whatever they were, represented perhaps his last chance to save not just his own legacy, but to validate his grandfather's life's work. But doubt gnawed at him. What if the seeds were dangerous? What if they were some kind of invasive species that could damage the local ecosystem? His agricultural training screamed at him to be cautious, to have the seeds tested before planting them. But testing would mean involving others, risking losing control of whatever his grandfather had discovered. And time wasn't on his side. Spring planting season was approaching, and the demolition crew would arrive in just 3 days. Michael's fingers traced the patterns on one of the seeds, feeling its unusual warmth. The choice before him was stark: continue down the path of conventional farming and almost certain failure, or take a leap of faith with these mysterious seeds. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. "When the time is right." A loud crash of thunder made his decision for him. Michael quickly gathered the seeds and placed them back in their burlap sack, along with his grandfather's journal. Tomorrow he would begin preparing a small, isolated section of his field, just enough for these 50 seeds. If they proved to be nothing special, he would have lost nothing but time. But if his grandfather's notes were accurate, if these truly were miracle seeds. As he climbed the creaking stairs to his bedroom that night, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Whatever these seeds were, they represented a chance, perhaps his last chance, to save everything his family had built over generations. The storm continued to rage outside, but for the first time in years, Michael Barrett slept soundly, the golden seeds secured safely under his pillow, their mysterious warmth seeping into his dreams. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the storm having washed away the lingering dust and leaving the air fresh with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Michael stood at the edge of his property, surveying his land with fresh eyes. After a night of restless dreams filled with golden fields and his grandfather's voice, he'd woken up with a mix of determination and apprehension churning in his stomach. The question wasn't just where to plant the seeds anymore. It was whether he should plant them at all. He'd spent the early morning hours poring over his grandfather's journal again, looking for any additional clues about the seed's origins. The more he read, the more questions arose. His grandfather's later entries became increasingly cryptic, filled with references to ancient guardians and natural magic that made Michael uncomfortable. Old Jack had written about indigenous tribes in South America who spoke of sacred plants with almost mythical properties, but he'd never specified exactly where or from whom he'd obtained the golden seeds. Walking the perimeter of his land, Michael finally settled on a secluded acre, nestled between a grove of old cottonwood trees and a natural rise in the landscape. The location was perfect, isolated enough to keep the plants hidden from prying eyes, but close enough to his house for regular monitoring. The soil there had always been particularly fertile, somehow managing to retain moisture even during the worst droughts. As he began turning the soil with his tractor, Michael's mind wandered to the potential consequences of his actions. The rational, university-educated part of his brain listed all the regulations he might be violating. Unknown seed varieties could be invasive, could carry diseases, or could cross-pollinate with neighboring crops. The Department of Agriculture had strict protocols for introducing new plant species, and for good reason. If anything went wrong, he could face more than just crop failure. He could be legally liable for any damage to the surrounding ecosystem. The work was therapeutic, though, and as the morning wore on, Michael found his scientific doubts being replaced by memories of his grandfather's unwavering conviction. Old Jack had never been wrong about farming innovations before. His techniques for soil conservation and natural pest control, once dismissed as old-fashioned, were now being rediscovered by a new generation of organic farmers. Maybe these seeds were his final gift to the family, a way to revolutionize farming just as he'd always dreamed. Around noon, Sarah Chen, his nearest neighbor, and the local agricultural extension agent, pulled up in her dusty pickup truck. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected any visitors, and the bag of golden seeds was still sitting prominently on his kitchen table, visible through the window. "Thought I'd check how you weathered the storm," Sarah called out as she approached, her boots squelching in the mud. "That was quite a light show last night." She paused, noticing the freshly tilled soil. "Planning some spring planting already? Bit early, isn't it?" Michael wiped the sweat from his forehead, buying time to think. Sarah was more than just a neighbor. She was one of the few people who had supported his efforts to save the farm when others had written him off. She'd helped him navigate government assistance programs and had even offered to buy part of his land herself to help him stay afloat. The thought of lying to her made his stomach churn. "Just preparing a test plot," he said finally, trying to keep his voice casual. "Found some old seeds in the barn, thought I might see if they're still viable." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it felt like one. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. As an agricultural agent, she knew all too well the risks of planting unknown seeds. "What kind of seeds? You know I can have them tested for viability at the extension office. No charge." Her offer was genuine, but Michael could hear the professional concern in her voice. "Just some experimental wheat varieties my grandfather was working on," he said, the lie coming easier now. "Nothing special, but I figured it couldn't hurt to try." He changed the subject quickly, asking about her own farm and the storm damage, but he could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. After Sarah left, Michael leaned against his tractor, guilt and uncertainty washing over him. He'd never lied to her before, and her visit had forced him to confront the reality of what he was considering. This wasn't just about him anymore. If these seeds turned out to be dangerous, he could be putting his entire community at risk. But as he walked back to check on the seeds, their golden surface gleaming in the afternoon sun, he felt that strange warmth again, not just from the seeds themselves, but from deep within his chest. It was the same feeling he used to get as a child when his grandfather would share his farming secrets. Old Jack had always said that true agricultural wisdom couldn't be found in textbooks or laboratories. It had to be discovered through experience and intuition. Making his decision, Michael spent the rest of the afternoon preparing the soil with meticulous care. He worked by hand now, wanting to feel every clump of earth, to know exactly where each seed would be placed. His grandfather's journal had emphasized the importance of proper spacing and depth, though the specific instructions were frustratingly vague. As he worked, Michael found himself talking to the seeds, just as he'd seen his grandfather do countless times before. "You better not make me regret this," he muttered, carefully placing the first seed in the rich, dark soil. The moment it left his hand, he could have sworn he felt a subtle vibration in the ground, like a distant heartbeat. Shaking off the strange sensation, he continued planting, measuring the distance between each seed with precise care. The sun was setting by the time he planted the last seed. 50 golden seeds, now buried in a perfect grid pattern across the hidden acre. Michael stood back, surveying his work. From this angle, nothing looked unusual, just freshly tilled soil ready for spring planting. But beneath that ordinary surface lay either the salvation of his farm or its final downfall. As darkness fell, Michael carefully encrypted his grandfather's journal entries about the seeds into his laptop, wanting to preserve the information while keeping it secure. He created detailed maps of the planting grid and established a schedule for monitoring the site. If these seeds were truly as revolutionary as his grandfather had believed, proper documentation would be essential. That night, as he sat on his porch watching the stars emerge, Michael felt the weight of his decision settling over him. There would be no turning back now. Either the seeds would grow and prove his grandfather right, or they would fail, taking with them perhaps his last chance to save the farm. The cool evening air carried the scent of possibility, and somewhere in the darkness, Michael could almost hear his grandfather's voice carried on the wind. "When we lose our seeds, we lose our freedom." Tomorrow, the waiting would begin. But for tonight, under the vast Montana sky, Michael Barrett allowed himself to dream of golden fields and miraculous harvests, of his grandfather's legacy vindicated, and his family's land restored to its former glory. Whether those dreams would become reality or remain just dreams, only time and the mysterious seeds would tell. The next 3 weeks passed with excruciating slowness. Michael established a careful routine, visiting the hidden plot at dawn and dusk each day. He'd installed a simple irrigation system, carefully calibrated to maintain optimal soil moisture, according to his grandfather's cryptic notes. The journal had emphasized the importance of morning dew and evening shadows, leading Michael to adjust his watering schedule to these specific times. What started as simple observation soon turned into an obsession. Michael set up a small weather station near the plot, monitoring temperature, humidity, and soil conditions with scientific precision. He'd also installed motion-activated cameras, officially to track deer and other crop-damaging wildlife, but really to ensure no one discovered his secret plantation. Every night he meticulously recorded his observations in a digital journal, comparing soil samples and atmospheric readings. The first signs appeared exactly 8 days after planting. Where conventional crops might take days to show even the smallest sprout, these plants burst from the soil with surprising vigor. The shoots weren't the pale green of normal seedlings, but rather a deep emerald color with subtle golden undertones that seemed to shift in different lights. Michael spent hours photographing and measuring each sprout, noting their unusual growth patterns. By the end of the second week, the plants had grown to knee height, their stalks thick and sturdy despite their rapid growth. The leaves were unlike anything Michael had ever seen, broad and symmetrical, with intricate patterns that mirrored the markings on the original seeds. More striking was their effect on the surrounding soil. In an ever-widening circle around each plant, the earth seemed richer, darker, more alive. Even the morning dew collected differently on these leaves, forming perfect golden droplets that seemed to glow in the early light. The transformation begins in the soil itself, his grandfather's journal had noted. The plants are not just growing, they're healing the earth. Michael had dismissed such poetic descriptions at first, but now he wasn't so sure. Soil samples from around the plants showed significantly higher nutrient levels than the surrounding areas. Even more intriguingly, These enhanced soil conditions seemed to be spreading beyond the test plot. His daily routine expanded to include extensive documentation. Michael found himself taking hundreds of photos, shooting video clips, and filling notebooks with observations. He noticed that the plants seemed to respond to sound and touch. Their leaves would turn slightly to track his movement, and they appeared to grow more vigorously on days when he spoke to them. It reminded him of his grandfather's insistence on talking to his crops, another practice Michael had once dismissed as superstition. The changes weren't limited to the test plot. The surrounding area was transforming too. Grass grew greener and thicker near the golden plants. Local wildlife seemed drawn to the area. Butterflies, bees, and even birds Michael hadn't seen in years began appearing regularly. He spotted a pair of monarch butterflies one morning, a species he thought had disappeared from the valley decades ago. But with the excitement came growing anxiety. The plant's unusual characteristics made them impossible to ignore, and Michael knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed. He began taking longer routes to the test plot, varying his schedule to avoid creating obvious patterns. He installed additional cameras and even considered setting up electric fencing, though he worried that would draw more attention than it prevented. His paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. Sarah Chen had driven by twice more, each time commenting on the unusual amount of wildlife activity in that section of his property. Local farmers had noticed the increased butterfly and bee activity too, with some even suggesting that Michael must have planted new wildflowers to attract pollinators. He deflected their questions with vague responses about trying some new organic farming techniques, but he could tell they weren't entirely convinced. The isolation was starting to wear on him. Michael found himself avoiding social interactions, making excuses to miss the weekly farmers market, and turning down invitations to community events. He knew he should be excited about the plant's progress, but instead, he felt increasingly burdened by the secrecy. His grandfather's journal offered little guidance about when or how to reveal the discovery to others. One particular entry haunted him. The seeds choose their guardian. They reveal their true nature only to those who understand their purpose. What was their purpose? Were these plants truly meant to revolutionize agriculture? Or was there something more to his grandfather's cryptic warnings about ancient guardians and natural magic? The pressure of secrecy was matched only by the growing evidence that these plants were far from ordinary. By the end of the third week, they had reached shoulder height, their stalks as thick as young trees. The leaves had developed an iridescent quality, seeming to shimmer with their own internal light in the late afternoon sun. Most remarkably, small pods had begun forming along the stalks, pods that seemed to pulse with a gentle golden glow in the darkness. Michael spent hours watching the pods develop, documenting their growth with time-lapse photography. They seemed to follow their own growth cycle, swelling and contracting with the phases of the moon, rather than the normal day-night cycle of conventional crops. His grandfather's journal had mentioned this lunar connection, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The physical demands of maintaining the secret plantation were taking their toll. Michael found himself sleeping less, spending long hours monitoring the plants and analyzing his data. He'd set up a small camp chair near the plot, often staying until well past midnight watching the pods pulse with their mysterious light. The golden glow had become a constant companion, visible even through his closed eyelids when he tried to sleep. His dreams had changed, too. They were filled with visions of vast golden fields stretching to the horizon, of crops that could feed entire nations, of his grandfather smiling proudly as Michael unlocked the secrets of these miraculous plants. But there were darker dreams, too, of shadowy figures trying to steal the plants, of government agents destroying his crops, of the plants themselves growing out of control and transforming the landscape into something alien and unrecognizable. As the fourth week approached, Michael knew he was reaching a critical point. The pods were nearly mature, their golden glow visible even in daylight now. Something was growing inside them, something that would either validate his grandfather's vision or confirm his worst fears. The waiting was becoming unbearable, but he knew that the next phase would bring even greater challenges, even greater. Standing in his test plot one evening, Watching the pods pulse with their ethereal light, Michael realized that his life had irrevocably changed. Whether these plants proved to be the agricultural miracle his grandfather had promised, or something else entirely, there would be no going back to his old life. He had become more than just a farmer tending his crops. He had become a guardian of something potentially revolutionary, something that could change the future of farming forever. As the sun set and the golden glow of the pods intensified, Michael whispered a quiet prayer to whatever forces had guided these mysterious seeds to him. Tomorrow would mark 1 month since planting, and according to his grandfather's journal, that meant the first pods would be ready to harvest. Whatever secrets they contained, whatever challenges lay ahead, Michael Barrett was about to discover exactly what kind of miracle his grandfather had entrusted to his care. The morning of the first harvest dawned with an unusual atmosphere. A thick fog had settled over the valley, shrouding Michael's farm in an ethereal mist that seemed to amplify the golden glow emanating from his secret plot. As he approached the plants, his heart pounding with anticipation, the first signs of trouble became apparent. Several of the pods had changed color overnight, shifting from their usual luminescent gold to a deep, pulsing crimson. The transformation wasn't limited to color. The affected pods had swollen to nearly twice their normal size, and the air around them felt charged with an inexplicable energy. Michael's hand trembled as he reached out to touch one of the crimson pods, only to quickly withdraw it as an electric-like sensation shot through his fingers. Temperature variance may trigger defensive mechanisms, his grandfather's journal had warned. The plants protect themselves when threatened. But the temperature had remained stable according to his monitoring equipment. Something else had triggered this change, and Michael had no idea what it was or how to address it. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the next few hours. The crimson coloration began spreading from pod to pod like a contagion, accompanied by a high-pitched humming sound that set Michael's teeth on edge. Worse, the plants seemed to be affecting each other. Healthy pods began showing signs of stress even when physically separated from the affected ones. It was as if they were communicating through some unseen network. Michael frantically searched his grandfather's journal for answers, but the relevant pages were frustratingly vague. References to harmonic resonance and synchronized maturation offered little practical guidance. One passage caught his attention. When the guardian's doubt peaks, the seeds sense the disruption. Faith must be absolute, or the cycle breaks. Had his own doubts somehow triggered this crisis? The past few weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions. Excitement warring with fear, hope battling with skepticism. Perhaps the plants were more attuned to his psychological state than he'd realized. His grandfather had always insisted that farming was as much about the farmer's relationship with their crops as it was about soil chemistry and weather patterns. The humming increased in intensity, and Michael noticed something even more alarming. The affected plants were releasing some kind of spores into the air, microscopic particles that glinted red in the morning light. He quickly pulled his shirt over his mouth and nose, but he could feel his eyes starting to water and his throat beginning to itch. Whatever these plants were releasing, it probably wasn't safe to breathe. Panic began to set in. Should he destroy the affected plants before they could spread whatever was happening? But what if this was a natural part of their development that his grandfather hadn't fully explained? The wrong decision could cost him everything. The journal had emphasized repeatedly that these plants were meant to save his farm, not destroy it. But looking at the crimson pods and swirling spores, Michael wasn't so sure anymore. His phone buzzed. Sarah Chen was calling. Through the fog, he could see her truck pulling up his driveway. The agricultural extension agent had probably noticed the unusual color patterns from the road. Even through the morning mist, the crimson glow would be hard to miss. Michael let the call go to voicemail, but he knew he couldn't avoid her forever. She would have questions, and she would be obligated to report anything unusual to her superiors. Racing back to his house, Michael gathered every piece of protective gear he could find. An old hazmat suit from when they used to spray pesticides, safety goggles, and a professional-grade respirator. He looked ridiculous, but he couldn't risk exposure to whatever the plants were releasing. The spores were becoming more visible now, creating a reddish haze that hung in the air around the test plot. As he approached the affected area in his protective gear, he noticed something extraordinary. The healthy plants seemed to be responding to the crisis, their golden pods pulsing in a synchronized rhythm that somehow countered the crimson glow of the affected ones. It reminded him of antibodies fighting an infection, as if the plants had their own immune system working at a collective level. Sarah's truck was getting closer. Michael could see her stopping periodically to take pictures with her phone. He had minutes, at most, before she discovered what was happening. The humming from the plants had reached an almost unbearable pitch, and the spores were now thick enough to create visible patterns in the air. In desperation, Michael did the only thing he could think of. He began talking to the plants just as his grandfather had always done. "I believe in you," he whispered, feeling slightly foolish, but pressing on anyway. "I believe in what you can become, what you can do for this farm, for agriculture, everywhere. I'm sorry for doubting. Please, show me what to do." To his amazement, the plants seemed to respond. The humming changed pitch, becoming almost melodic, and the golden pods began pulsing more intensely. The crimson pods appeared to react to this change, their angry red glow flickering like a flame in the wind. The spores in the air started moving in new patterns, drawn toward the ground as if pulled by an invisible force. Michael's relief was short-lived, however. As the spores settled, they began to change the soil itself, spreading the same crimson color through the earth like ink through water. The ground felt warm to the touch, even through his protective boots, and small cracks began appearing in the soil, releasing more of the mysterious spores. The sound of Sarah's truck door slamming snapped Michael back to reality. He could hear her footsteps approaching, her voice calling out his name. In his panic, he made a decision that would either save or doom everything. He ran to his irrigation system and activated the emergency flush, sending a flood of water across the entire test plot. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The plants began moving, actually moving, their stalks twisting and bending like living creatures. The crimson pods released a final burst of spores before seemingly dissolving in the water, while the golden pods sealed themselves tightly, becoming almost armored in appearance. The humming reached a crescendo before cutting off abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. "Michael?" Sarah's voice was closer now, filled with professional concern. "What's going on here? What are you growing?" As the water continued to flood the test plot, Michael watched in equal parts horror and amazement as the plants began what looked like a transformation. The crisis wasn't over. It was evolving into something else entirely, something his grandfather's journal hadn't prepared him for. Whatever secrets these plants held, they were about to be exposed, ready or not. Standing there in his protective gear, watching his carefully maintained secrecy literally dissolve in the flood, Michael realized he had reached a point of no return. The next few minutes would determine not just the fate of his miracle plants, but possibly the future of his farm and his freedom as well. Sarah was about to discover everything, and with her, the entire agricultural establishment would soon know about his unauthorized experiment. Through his fogged-up safety goggles, Michael watched Sarah Chen's face transform from concern to shock as she took in the scene before her. The agricultural extension agent stood frozen at the edge of the test plot, her phone dropping limply to her side as she stared at the writhing plants and the swirling patterns of golden and crimson light that danced through the morning mist. "Dear God, Michael," she whispered, taking an involuntary step backward. "What have you done?" Before he could respond, a new crisis demanded his attention. The flood of water he'd released hadn't stopped the plant's transformation. If anything, it had accelerated it. The remaining crimson pods were bursting open one by one, releasing not spores this time, but something that looked almost like liquid light. It splashed onto the waterlogged soil, creating expanding circles of luminescence that reminded Michael of oil on water, but with an intensity that hurt his eyes even through the protective goggles. "Stay back," he shouted at Sarah, who had taken out her phone again and was rapidly typing something. "Please, I can explain everything, but right now you need to keep your distance." The desperation in his voice must have convinced her. because she retreated several steps, though she continued documenting everything with her phone. The transformation was spreading faster now. The golden pods that had sealed themselves were beginning to pulse in a new rhythm, more urgent than before. The plant stalks had grown impossibly flexible, weaving together into complex patterns that seemed to form and reform with deliberate purpose. The air was filled with a sound that was no longer just humming. It had become almost musical, a chord that seemed to resonate with something deep in Michael's chest. His monitoring equipment was going haywire. Temperature readings fluctuated wildly, and his soil sensors were reporting impossible numbers. The tablet he used to record his observations sparked and died in his hands, its screen flickering with strange patterns before going dark. In the distance, he could hear car engines, more vehicles approaching along his access road. Sarah's voice cut through his panic. "Michael, I've had to report this. The Department of Agriculture is already on their way, and I've contacted the Environmental Protection Agency. Whatever these plants are, they're clearly not natural, and they're releasing unknown substances into the environment. This is beyond serious." Michael's heart sank. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but he'd hoped to have more time, to better understand what he was dealing with before having to explain it to others. Now everything was spiraling out of control, and he had no idea how to stop it. The floodwater had spread beyond the test plot now, carrying traces of the luminescent substance with it. To Michael's horror, he could see it heading toward his main wheat fields. If these plants could affect normal crops, if they could spread whatever was happening here. His thoughts were interrupted by a searing pain in his head. The protective suit suddenly felt suffocating, and his vision began to blur. The spores. He must have been exposed despite his precautions. He stumbled, catching himself on one of the plant stalks. Instead of bending under his weight, the stalk seemed to grip him, its surface texture changing to provide support. "Michael." Sarah was moving toward him now, despite her earlier caution. "You need medical attention. We don't know what these plants are releasing into the air." She was right, but Michael couldn't leave. Not now. Not when everything was changing. Through his increasingly clouded vision, he could see the plants continuing their transformation. The golden pods that had sealed themselves were beginning to open again, but differently this time. Instead of releasing spores or light, they were revealing what looked like fruits, perfect spheres that glowed with a soft, steady radiance. More vehicles were arriving. Through the fog, Michael could make out official-looking SUVs and what appeared to be a hazmat response team. Men and women in white protective suits were emerging, carrying sophisticated-looking equipment. Sarah was talking to someone on her phone, gesturing at the transformed test plot with increasing urgency. The pain in Michael's head intensified, but with it came something else: understanding. The plants weren't just changing, they were adapting. His grandfather's journal had hinted at this, but seeing it happen was something else entirely. They were responding to the threat of discovery, to the water, to everything happening around them, but not in the way he'd feared. They weren't dying or releasing toxins. They were evolving. Through the waves of pain and dizziness, Michael remembered more fragments from his grandfather's journal. The plants respond to intention. Fear breeds fear. Trust breeds trust. The crisis had been triggered by his own paranoia, his own doubts. And now, facing exposure and possible destruction, the plants were showing their true nature. The transformation reached its peak just as the first hazmat team reached the edge of the test plot. The intertwined stalks had formed a kind of organic lattice, supporting dozens of the glowing spherical fruits. The crimson light had faded entirely, replaced by a steady golden radiance that seemed to pulse in time with Michael's heartbeat. The air was thick with a sweet, clean scent that cut through even his respirator. "Stop!" Michael managed to call out, his voice hoarse. "Don't destroy them, look!" Where the luminescent water had reached his wheat fields, something incredible was happening. The struggling wheat plants were straightening, their colors deepening from sickly yellow to healthy green. Even as the hazmat team began setting up containment equipment, new growth was visibly spreading through his fields like a wave of vitality. Sarah was the first to notice the changes in the soil readings on her professional equipment. "These can't be right," she muttered, checking and rechecking her instruments. "The soil composition is changing. Nitrogen levels, mineral content, microbial activity. Everything's off the charts." Michael's vision was starting to clear now, the pain in his head receding. The plant's transformation had stabilized, leaving behind something that looked both alien and perfect. The glowing fruits hung like golden lanterns throughout the lattice structure, and everywhere the floodwater had reached, normal plants were showing extraordinary signs of growth and health. A senior-looking official from one of the government vehicles approached, accompanied by what appeared to be a scientist carrying sophisticated scanning equipment. "Mr. Barrett," the official began, his voice stern but controlled, "you need to explain exactly what you're growing here and where you obtained it." Michael looked at the transformed plants, at his revitalized wheat fields, at the gathered officials and their uncertain faces. He thought of his grandfather's last words about the seeds choosing their guardian, about the importance of truth and trust. The time for secrecy was over. Whatever happened next would depend on his ability to convince these people that what they were seeing wasn't a threat, but a gift. Possibly the most important agricultural advancement in human history. But as he opened his mouth to begin his explanation, a new sound cut through the tense atmosphere. The golden fruits had begun to chime, creating a harmony that seemed to resonate with something deep in the earth itself. The transformation wasn't over. It was entering a new phase, and Michael realized that his greatest challenges still lay ahead. The chiming from the golden fruits grew louder, creating a symphony that seemed to pulse through the ground itself. The government officials and hazmat team froze in place, their instruments forgotten as they stared at the transformed plants in wonder. Even Sarah Chen, who had seen her share of agricultural phenomena over her 15 years as an extension agent, stood transfixed by the display. The morning light caught the golden glow of the fruits, creating halos that seemed to dance through the dissipating mist. But it was the arrival of old Joe Henderson that changed everything. The 80-year-old farmer's truck came bouncing down the access road, the ancient Ford F-150's familiar rattle, cutting through the ethereal chiming of the plants. The hazmat team was in the middle of setting up containment barriers when Joe's truck skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust. He stepped out with the unhurried confidence of someone who had seen it all before, his weathered cowboy hat tilted at the same angle it had been for the past 40 years. "Well, well," old Joe said, surveying the scene through eyes that had seen half a century of harvests. "Jack Barrett's golden seeds finally decided to show themselves." The gathered officials turned to stare at him, and Michael felt a surge of hope. If anyone could help explain what was happening, it would be old Joe, the man who'd been more like an uncle to him than his father's friend. "You knew about these?" the senior official demanded, turning his attention from Michael to Joe. His name tag identified him as Dr. Richardson from the Department of Agriculture. "Sir, we're dealing with an unknown biological entity that's releasing unidentified substances into the environment. This is a potential hazard situation that requires immediate containment." Old Joe just chuckled, the sound as warm and familiar as summer rain. He walked straight past the warning signs the hazmat team had started to set up, his boots leaving prints in the soil that seemed to shimmer with the same golden light as the plants. "Hazard? Boys, what you're looking at is the future of farming, just like Jack always said it would be. And I reckon it's about time I shared what I know about these beauties." As if responding to old Joe's presence, the plant's chiming shifted to a gentler tone, and the golden light seemed to warm. The complex lattice of stalks swayed slightly, despite the lack of wind, as if acknowledging an old friend. Michael remembered his grandfather mentioning Joe in his journal, cryptic references he'd never fully understood until now. The pain in his head had completely subsided, replaced by a clarity that made every detail of the unfolding scene crystal sharp. 25 years ago, Joe began, his voice carrying across the now silent gathering, Jack Barrett and I traveled to a remote valley in Peru. We'd heard stories about ancient agricultural practices, about plants that could restore dead soil to life. Most folks thought it was just legends, but Jack believed. He paused, running his hand along one of the transformed stalks, which seemed to lean into his touch. Sarah Chen had moved closer, her phone now recording Joe's every word. The government officials exchanged glances but made no move to stop him. The scientist with the scanning equipment, a young man whose enthusiasm seemed barely contained by his protective suit, was frantically taking readings, muttering in amazement at whatever his instruments were telling him. The indigenous people there, the Quechua, lived in a valley that shouldn't have been able to support any crops, Joe continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a practiced storyteller. The soil was poor, the altitude too high, the weather too harsh. But their fields were the most vibrant I'd ever seen, plants growing together in ways that defied everything we knew about agriculture. They had beans climbing up corn stalks that shouldn't have been able to support their weight, fruits growing in patterns that looked like sacred geometry. The transformation of Michael's wheat fields had become impossible to ignore. Where the luminescent water had spread, the once struggling crops were now vibrant and healthy. The change was spreading outward in a visible wave, like ripples in a pond. The wheat stalks had taken on a golden sheen, and their heads were filling out with grain before everyone's eyes, a process that should have taken weeks happening in minutes. The elders showed us their seed vault, hidden in caves that had been used for thousands of years, Joe went on, moving closer to the transformed test plot. They had varieties of plants that didn't exist anywhere else in the world, protected and passed down through generations of guardians. But it was the golden seeds that called to Jack. The elders said they were their most precious treasure, seeds that had been cultivated since before the Inca, before any empire had claimed their lands. Michael stepped forward, his protective suit now feeling unnecessary, as the air around the plants had cleared of all spores and mist. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked Joe, unable to keep the hint of accusation from his voice. "All these weeks, I've been struggling to understand what was happening, feeling like I was going crazy." Old Joe's eyes twinkled with a familiar light that reminded Michael so much of his grandfather. "The seeds choose their guardian, Michael, just like they chose your grandfather. If I'd told you everything, if you hadn't discovered their power for yourself, they might never have shown their true nature." The Quechua elders were very clear about that. The seeds had to be found, not given. They had to reveal themselves in their own time. The senior official, Dr. Richardson, cleared his throat. "This is all very interesting, but we're still dealing with an unauthorized introduction of foreign biological material. There are protocols, regulations." His voice trailed off as one of the golden fruits detached itself and floated down to eye level with him, its pulsing light reflecting in his startled eyes. "Look at your readings," Sarah interrupted, holding up her soil testing equipment. The screen was displaying numbers that seemed to defy possibility. "The soil composition isn't just improving, it's being completely revitalized. Microbial activity has increased by 300%, mineral content is optimizing itself, and the water retention capacity has doubled. In all my years as an agricultural agent, I've never seen anything like it. These readings, they're what we'd expect to see in the most fertile soil on Earth." More vehicles were arriving now, creating an impromptu parking lot along the access road. Word had spread through the farming community like wildfire, and Michael's neighbors were coming to see for themselves. Among them was Tommy Wilson, whose family had been forced to sell their farm just months ago to one of the big agricultural corporations. The young man's face showed a mixture of wonder and pain as he looked at the transformed fields. "The plants aren't just affecting Michael's fields," Sarah announced, checking her expanded readings. She walked the perimeter of the property, her equipment beeping steadily. "The soil improvement is spreading beyond his property lines. It's like they're healing the entire valley. The mycorrhizal networks in the soil are expanding at an unprecedented rate, creating new nutrient pathways. It's as if the plants are rebuilding the soil's entire ecosystem from the ground up." Old Joe nodded, unsurprised. That's what they were designed to do thousands of years ago. Not just to produce food, but to restore balance to the earth itself. The Quechua elders told us these plants were created during a time of great environmental crisis, when their ancestors' lands were dying. Jack used to say that modern farming had forgotten its true purpose, not just to take from the soil, but to give back to it. The golden fruits had begun to change again, their glow pulsing in a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeats of those gathered around them. The latticed structure of the plants was expanding, creating new growth patterns that defied conventional botanical understanding. Tendrils of golden light reached out to touch nearby plants, which responded by growing stronger and healthier. "Mr. Henderson," the young scientist with the scanning equipment said, barely containing his excitement, "these plants appear to be exhibiting properties that could revolutionize our understanding of agricultural science. They're not just growing, they're actively transforming the biological and chemical composition of their environment. The way they're altering soil chemistry, their growth patterns, their apparent ability to influence other plants. It's unprecedented in modern botany." Tommy Wilson stepped forward, his eyes fixed on his family's old property visible in the distance. The once vibrant fields had turned brown and lifeless under corporate farming practices. "Could they restore my family's land?" he asked, voice thick with emotion. "The soil there's been dead for years from over-farming and chemical use." Before anyone could respond, one of the golden fruits detached itself from its stem and actually floated, into Tommy's outstretched hands. The young man gasped as the fruit began to pulse with a warmer light, as if recognizing his intention and his connection to the land. "I believe that's your answer," old Joe said softly. "The plants know what they're needed for. They always have. The Quechua elders told us these seeds would eventually spread to where they were needed most, but only through those who truly loved the land." The government officials huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers. The scientist was practically bouncing with excitement as he reviewed his data. Sarah Chen was already on her phone, presumably contacting her superiors about what she was witnessing. Through it all, the plants continued their gentle chiming, their golden light spreading further across the valley with each passing minute. Michael looked around at the gathering of his neighbors, at the transformed plants, at the spreading wave of renewal moving through his fields. His grandfather's legacy wasn't just a miracle crop or a scientific breakthrough. It was a chance to heal the land itself, to restore what generations of industrial farming had depleted. He could see it in Tommy's eyes as the young man cradled the golden fruit, in Sarah's amazed expression as she reviewed her soil readings, in old Joe's knowing smile. "We'll need to establish proper protocols," Dr. Richardson finally announced, his official demeanor softened by what he'd witnessed. "Study teams, controlled trials, environmental impact assessments. But," he added, looking at the obvious transformation taking place before his eyes, "I believe we're witnessing something that could change the future of agriculture forever. Mr. Barrett, your grandfather's discovery, it could be the answer to the global soil crisis we've been facing." The chiming of the plants swelled one final time before settling into a gentle hum, as if agreeing with his assessment. The morning sun had finally burned away the last of the fog, revealing the full extent of the transformation. Where there had been dying fields and depleted soil, new life was springing forth, carrying with it the promise of renewal and hope. The golden light had spread to touch every corner of the valley, and in its warm glow, Michael could almost see his grandfather's dream taking root and growing toward the future. The following weeks transformed not just Michael's farm, but the entire agricultural community of Paradise Valley. The initial fear and skepticism had given way to cautious optimism as the effects of the golden plants became impossible to ignore. Government scientists had established a permanent research station on Michael's property, their sophisticated equipment confirming what everyone could see with their own eyes. Something revolutionary was happening to the soil itself. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the lead botanist from the Department of Agriculture's Special Research Division, stood in the center of Michael's transformed test plot, carefully examining one of the golden fruits through a specialized scanner. The genetic structure of these plants, she explained to the gathered group of officials and local farmers, is unlike anything we've ever encountered. They appear to be actively adapting to our soil conditions, but in a way that enhances rather than damages the existing ecosystem. The morning sun caught the golden lattice of stalks and fruits, creating a natural cathedral of light and shadow. What had started as 50 experimental plants had evolved into an integrated network that now covered nearly 2 acres. More remarkably, the plants seemed to know exactly how far to spread. They stopped precisely at the boundaries Michael had mentally set for them, as if reading his intentions. The soil samples are even more fascinating, Sarah Chen added, pulling up detailed charts on her tablet. We're seeing the restoration of mineral profiles that haven't been present in this valley for generations. The mycorrhizal networks have expanded throughout the entire region, creating what we're calling super soil, earth that's practically immune to erosion and capable of retaining water far better than anything we've seen before. Tommy Wilson's family had been the first to benefit from the plant's remarkable properties. Using seeds from the original golden fruits, they had managed to buy back their family farm and begin its restoration. Now, just weeks later, their once dead fields were showing signs of life that defied conventional agricultural wisdom. It's not just about the soil chemistry, Old Joe explained to a group of visiting agricultural experts. These plants seem to understand what the land needs. They adapt differently in each location, working with the native species rather than overwhelming them. His words were confirmed by the various test plots now scattered throughout the valley, each showing unique growth patterns tailored to their specific locations. Michael watched all this activity from his porch, his grandfather's journal open on his lap. The mysterious warnings about ancient guardians and natural magic made more sense now. These weren't just plants. They were caretakers created by ancient wisdom to heal damaged earth. His grandfather had understood this, had spent years preparing for the moment when the seeds would be ready to reveal their true nature. Dr. Rodriguez approached him, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "We've completed the initial genetic sequencing," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "Mr. Barrett, these plants appear to be carrying genetic information that could revolutionize our understanding of agricultural science. They don't just grow, they communicate, adapt, and actively improve their environment. It's as if they were designed to be perfect ecological engineers." The implications were staggering. Early tests showed that crops grown in the enhanced soil required significantly less water and no chemical fertilizers. They were naturally resistant to pests and diseases, and their nutritional content was markedly higher than conventional produces. More importantly, the soil improvement appeared to be permanent. The enhanced microbial networks and mineral profiles remained stable even in areas where the golden plants had been removed. "Your grandfather was right," Sarah said, joining them on the porch. "These plants aren't just a new crop variety. They're a tool for healing the earth itself. We're seeing similar results in test plots across the valley. Tommy's family farm is already producing crops with yields that should have taken years to achieve." The government's response had evolved from initial alarm to cautious support. After extensive testing confirmed that the plants posed no environmental or health risks, the Department of Agriculture had established a special research initiative focused on understanding and potentially replicating their beneficial properties. Michael's farm had become a living laboratory, attracting scientists and agricultural experts from around the world. But perhaps the most significant change was in the local farming community itself. The success of the Wilson family farm had sparked a movement. Other families who had sold their land to corporate farming operations were beginning to return, drawn by the possibility of restoration and renewal. The golden plants seemed to respond especially well to family farmers, as if they could sense the generational connection to the land. "It's like they're teaching us," Old Joe observed one evening, watching the sunset paint the transformed fields in shades of amber and gold. "Everything your grandfather tried to tell us about working with nature instead of against it, these plants are showing us how it's done." The research teams had documented numerous unexpected benefits. Native bird species were returning to the valley, drawn by the improved ecosystem. Beneficial insects, many of which hadn't been seen in the area for decades, were reappearing. The local bee population had tripled, and honey produced from the enhanced fields showed remarkable medicinal properties. Michael found himself spending hours in the test plot, talking to the plants just as his grandfather had done. They seemed to respond to his presence, their gentle chiming taking on different tones depending on his mood or intentions. Dr. Rodriguez's team had recorded these acoustic variations, discovering that the plants produced specific frequencies that appeared to stimulate growth in surrounding vegetation. "We're calling it acoustic agriculture," she explained during one of her daily briefings. "The vibrations these plants produce appear to influence everything from soil particle aggregation to seed germination rates. It's as if they're conducting a symphony of growth." The golden fruits had proven to be more than just seed carriers. When processed, they yielded a substance that could rapidly restore degraded soil. Early trials in drought-stricken regions showed promising results, with dead land showing signs of renewal within weeks of treatment. The Department of Agriculture was already discussing plans for a larger-scale implementation program. As Michael watched his transformed farm thrive, he often thought about his grandfather's journey, the years of searching, the careful preparation, the faith that someday these miraculous plants would help restore balance to the earth. Jack Barrett had understood something that modern agriculture had forgotten, that true farming wasn't about dominating nature, but about partnering with it. The sun was setting over Paradise Valley, casting long shadows across the golden fields. In the fading light, the plant's natural luminescence began to show, creating patterns of light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the earth itself. Michael's grandfather's dream had not just come true, it had exceeded all expectations, offering hope for a future where agriculture could heal rather than harm the planet. 3 months after the discovery of the golden plants, Michael Barrett stood before a packed auditorium at Montana State University's Agricultural Sciences Center. The same institution that had taught him conventional farming methods was now eager to learn about his grandfather's legacy. Scientists, farmers, and agricultural experts from around the world filled every seat, their attention focused on the remarkable data being displayed on the screen behind him. "What we're seeing isn't just crop improvement," Michael explained, gesturing to the time-lapse images showing the transformation of Paradise Valley. "It's the restoration of entire ecosystems. The golden plants aren't just growing, they're teaching us how to farm in harmony with nature." His voice cracked slightly as he thought about how his grandfather would have loved to see this moment. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward to present the latest research findings. "The soil regeneration process has exceeded our most optimistic projections," she announced, pulling up charts showing the valley's transformation. Areas that were considered dead zones just months ago are now showing soil quality levels comparable to pristine rainforest conditions. The microbial diversity is unprecedented. In the front row, old Joe Henderson sat with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Next to him, Tommy Wilson and his father were holding hands, their own eyes glistening as they watched footage of their restored family farm. The Wilson farm had become a symbol of hope for family farmers everywhere, proving that even the most damaged land could be brought back to life. Sarah Chen, who had initially reported the mysterious plants to authorities, now served as the primary liaison between the government research teams and local farmers. "The most remarkable aspect," she added, joining Michael on stage, "is how the benefits continue to spread. The enhanced soil conditions are expanding beyond the treated areas, creating a domino effect of environmental restoration." The presentation included detailed analysis of the golden plant's unique properties. Their ability to communicate through chemical signals and acoustic vibrations had revolutionized understanding of plant intelligence. The fruits, when processed, yielded compounds that could jumpstart soil regeneration in even the most depleted earth. But perhaps most importantly, the plants seemed to form special bonds with family farmers, responding to their care and intention in ways that corporate agricultural operations couldn't replicate. Michael felt a lump in his throat as he showed the next slides, photographs of his grandfather's expeditions to Peru, including some he'd only recently discovered. There was Jack Barrett, standing with Quechua elders, his eyes bright with the knowledge of what he'd found. "My grandfather understood that these plants weren't just crops," Michael said. "They were keepers of ancient agricultural wisdom, created to help restore balance when the earth needed healing." The audience sat in rapt attention as Michael shared more details about the plant's impact on Paradise Valley. Native wildlife had returned in force, with species not seen in decades making their home in the restored ecosystem. The valley's water table had begun to replenish itself, and the enhanced soil's water retention capabilities had made irrigation almost unnecessary. Local honey production had skyrocketed, and tests showed the honey contained compounds with remarkable medicinal properties. But the most significant change, Michael continued, his voice growing stronger, has been in our community. He showed pictures of farmers who had returned to the valley, families reunited with their land, children playing in fields that just months ago had been dusty and dead. These plants aren't just healing the earth, they're healing our connection to it. Dr. Richardson, the Department of Agriculture official who had initially threatened to shut down Michael's farm, now stood to address the audience. What we're witnessing in Paradise Valley represents a paradigm shift in agriculture, he announced. These plants have demonstrated that regenerative farming isn't just possible, it's the key to our agricultural future. The government's position had evolved dramatically over the past months. After extensive testing confirmed the plant's safety and benefits, a special initiative had been launched to study and implement their properties nationwide. Paradise Valley had been designated as a living laboratory, with Michael's farm at its heart. Tommy Wilson took the stage to share his family's story. 6 months ago, we thought we'd lost our heritage forever, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Now, our land is more alive than it's ever been. These plants, they don't just grow crops, they restore hope. Behind him, images showed the transformation of the Wilson farm from barren earth to vibrant fields teeming with life. Sarah Chen presented data showing the economic impact on the valley. Property values had stabilized as family farms became viable again. The enhanced crop yields and reduced input costs had made small-scale farming profitable once more. Local farmers' markets were flourishing, and a new cooperative had formed to help distribute the benefits of the golden plants to other struggling agricultural communities. The plants seemed to recognize the difference between industrial agriculture and family farming, Dr. Rodriguez explained. They respond to the personal connection, the generational knowledge, the love for the land that family farmers bring. It's as if they were designed to work in partnership with human caretakers who truly understand their purpose. Michael's voice shook as he shared the most personal part of his presentation, his grandfather's journal entries about the golden seeds. He knew these plants would change everything, Michael said. He spent years preparing for the moment when they would be ready to share their gifts. But he also understood that they needed the right guardian, the right moment, the right intention. The audience sat in stunned silence as Michael played recordings of the plant's acoustic emissions, the beautiful, haunting sounds that had become known as the songs of renewal. Research had shown that these vibrations played a crucial role in soil restoration, but their effect on human listeners was equally profound. Many reported feeling a deep sense of connection to the earth when hearing them. As the presentation concluded, Michael found himself surrounded by people eager to learn more, to touch the golden fruits he'd brought, to understand how they too could participate in this agricultural renaissance. But his eyes were drawn to a quiet corner of the auditorium, where old Joe stood talking with a group of elderly farmers, their faces lit with recognition and hope. "Your grandfather would be proud," Sarah said softly, joining Michael as he watched the scene. "He always said the future of farming lay in rediscovering its past. These plants are proving him right in ways even he might not have imagined. The golden fruits in Michael's bag seemed to pulse warmly in agreement, their gentle chiming barely audible above the excited conversations filling the auditorium. The seeds that had once been hidden beneath his grandfather's barn had grown into something far more valuable than just a miracle crop. They had become a symbol of renewal, a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern needs, a reminder that the earth still held secrets that could help heal our wounds if we only knew how to listen. 1 year after the discovery of the golden seeds, Paradise Valley had become a worldwide symbol of agricultural regeneration. Michael Barrett stood in his grandfather's restored barn, now transformed into a visitor center and research facility, surrounded by photographs documenting the valley's incredible transformation. The old building, once scheduled for demolition, had been carefully preserved as a reminder of where it all began. On this particular morning, a group of international agricultural students had gathered to hear Michael share his story. The barn's renovated interior featured interactive displays showing the evolution of the golden plants, time-lapse videos of soil restoration, and a special section dedicated to Jack Barrett's research. The most important lesson we've learned, Michael explained to the eager students, isn't just about the plants themselves. It's about remembering that true innovation often means rediscovering ancient wisdom. He gestured to a wall displaying his grandfather's journal entries alongside photographs from the original Peru expedition. These plants aren't new. They're a gift from the past, waiting for the right moment to help us restore balance to our world. The valley's transformation had exceeded everyone's expectations. The Department of Agriculture's latest report showed that soil quality throughout the region had improved by over 400%. Crop yields had stabilized at levels previously thought impossible without chemical inputs. But perhaps most remarkably, the benefits had begun to spread far beyond Paradise Valley. Sarah Chen, now heading a new division focused on regenerative agriculture, joined Michael to share the latest data. "We've successfully established golden plant nurseries in 20 different countries," she announced. "Each location shows the same pattern: soil restoration, increased biodiversity, and a natural strengthening of local ecosystems. But the plants adapt differently in each place, working with native species rather than displacing them." The Wilson family farm had become a model for agricultural restoration. Tommy Wilson, standing beside his father, explained to the students how their once-dead fields now produced abundant crops with minimal irrigation. "The plants don't just grow food," he said. "They rebuild the entire system. Our bees are thriving, beneficial insects have returned, and we've recorded over 30 species of birds that haven't been seen in the valley for decades." Dr. Rodriguez's research team had made remarkable discoveries about the plant's capabilities. "They don't just communicate through chemical signals," she explained, showing microscopic images of the soil network. "They actively create what we're calling regenerative zones, areas where soil biology is completely restructured to optimize growth conditions. It's as if they remember what healthy soil should look like and work to recreate it." Old Joe Henderson, now approached his 90th year but still sharp as ever, had become a beloved figure in the agricultural community. He spent his days sharing stories about Jack Barrett and teaching younger farmers the importance of working with nature rather than against it. "Your grandfather knew," he said to Michael one evening, "that someday the world would need to remember what these plants could teach us." The economic impact on the region had been profound. Family farms were returning to profitability without relying on expensive inputs or government subsidies. A new generation of young farmers, inspired by the success stories from Paradise Valley, had begun reclaiming abandoned agricultural land. The golden plants seemed to respond especially well to these newcomers, as if recognizing their genuine desire to heal the earth. "We need to remember," Michael told the students, "that this gift comes with responsibility. These plants aren't just tools for better farming, they're teachers, showing us how to restore our connection to the land." He demonstrated how the plants responded to human interaction, their gentle chiming, changing tone as different people approached them. The international research community had documented numerous unexpected benefits. The enhanced honey produced by bees feeding on the golden plants showed remarkable medicinal properties. Soil treated with derivatives from the golden fruits had proven effective in reducing desert encroachment in Africa. Even urban farming projects had successfully used the plant's properties to rehabilitate contaminated city soils. But perhaps the most significant impact had been on the way people thought about agriculture itself. The success of Paradise Valley had demonstrated that regenerative farming wasn't just an idealistic dream. It was a practical solution to many of the world's agricultural challenges. Farmers who had once been skeptical of organic methods were now eager to learn about working with nature rather than against it. "What questions do you have about our story?" Michael asked the assembled students, knowing that their curiosity and enthusiasm would help carry this agricultural renaissance forward. "What dreams do you have for your own communities?" The responses poured in, each one reflecting hope for a future where farming could help heal the earth rather than harm it. And now, We'd like to hear from you, our viewers. How has this story touched your own connection to the land? What possibilities do you see for regenerative agriculture in your community? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of agricultural innovation and renewal. Remember, every piece of land holds the potential for restoration, and every farmer can be part of this growing movement toward regenerative agriculture. Sometimes the most powerful changes start with simply believing in possibilities, just as my grandfather did when he discovered those golden seeds. We'll be sharing more updates from Paradise Valley and other communities embracing these revolutionary farming methods. Hit the like button if you want to see more stories about how ancient wisdom and modern science can work together to create a more sustainable future for agriculture. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery and renewal. The story of the golden seeds reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary solutions are waiting to be rediscovered, hidden like precious treasures in the wisdom of the past. Together, we can help write the next chapter in the story of sustainable agriculture. As the sun set over Paradise Valley, casting its golden light across the transformed fields, Michael stood in the spot where he'd first discovered the mysterious seeds. The land was alive with the gentle chiming of the plants, their song a reminder that when we learn to listen to nature's wisdom, miracles are possible. His grandfather's dream hadn't just come true. It had grown into something far more powerful, a movement that was changing the face of agriculture around the world, one restored field at a time.